Good morning, guys. It is Tuesday for anyone who needs to hear that. I hope you guys are all doing well. Today we're going to be going over measures 35 to 43 in Tadihe. Go ahead, check the description box, click on the instruction for your section, and let's get started. Okay, first violins, there's some things that we need to mark in before we go through this. Starting in measure 35, you're going to be in first position. Make sure you play that last note of measure 35 with the fourth finger, that A. Then in the next measure, measure 36, that G sharp is going to be a high 3. And just make sure you understand that the G sharp lasts through the entire measure, so the second to last note, that G is also sharp. In measure 37, the last note is also a G, but it goes down to a G natural. So I would mark an arrow down or just the natural sign. 38 is fine. You can play that in first position, open D. In 39, you're going to start with an open A in first position. And then I want you to shift up on the last note, the F natural, so that'll be a low 3 in third position. And you know why? Because I literally hate low 1 on the E string. Then in measure 40, just stay in third position, so it'll be 2 and then 4, and that's a low 4 because it's C natural. Then at measure 41, where it says very dramatic, you're going to go down to first position. The D sharp is going to be a low 1. Make sure that you understand that that D sharp lasts through the whole measure, so the third beat that looks like a normal D is going to be a D sharp again. So you're just going to go back to the low 1. 42, play the D natural with the fourth finger, and then the last note of that measure is a G sharp, so it's going to be low 1 on the G string. So that's what all of that's going to look like. I want to go over the shift up to third position and then the shift back. So take a look at measure 39. As usual, when we're practicing a shift, we're going to talk about the finger that we're shifting from. So in this case, we're shifting from the C natural, so that would be a second finger. So if you think about where your second finger is going, your second finger would be going to E. So if you have a fourth finger tape, that's where your second finger is going. We're going to practice that shift first. And then you would put your third finger down right next to it for F natural. So then you can practice it with a slur. And then slowly you can take out that E, so you're just going from the C to the F. And then the whole measure together will sound like this. Then the next measure, you're going to stay in third position. And in the beginning of measure 41, you're going to shift down to the D sharp low 1. Other things to notice would be the dynamics. You start out forte in 35 and that lasts all the way to 40, and then there's a sudden piano, a subito piano. It doesn't say subito, but since there's no decrescendo, it's just forte all the way from 35 and then all of a sudden it's piano. You need to be really careful about that, especially since you just did a shift. You may be focused more on that than you are on the dynamics. Then at the end of 40, there's a crescendo into 41 during that dotted half note tied to the eighth note. So one thing I would do is I might even write save on that note because it's an up bow and you're going to have to crescendo, which is good because on an up bow you're going towards your hand, so towards the heaviest part of the bow. But you're going to have to save the bow because if you spend it too much, you're not going to have anything left to do that crescendo. With the crescendo, it would be like this. And if there's a break between the C and that D sharp, it's pretty much unavoidable. If there is a break there between those two notes, that's fine. The last thing I want to mention before we just play through this is the articulation 41 and 42. You've got an accent on the first eighth note and then the dot on the second eighth note. So think of the first eighth note as a little bit longer and heavier, and then you're actually going to come off the string on the second one. So just practicing it on open D. So the actual notes would be D sharp first and then D natural, so. And the quarter notes at the end of both of those measures are going to be legato. If you want to put a tenuto mark over them, go for it. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and set my metronome at 100 and play through this. 2, 3, 4, rest, rest. Something else else I noticed while I was playing that I didn't mention before, there are a lot of rests throughout this section, and those rests make room for other sections to interject with their own parts. So make sure that you get out of the way on those rests. The eighth note rests in 36 and 38 and similar rhythms. You can set your bow back down on the string during the rest to mark the rest, and then during measures like 37 and 39, just make sure that that half note rest gets its full value and you're not cutting it short on either end. Okay, thank you so much, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for the next part. Okay, second violins. A few things to mark before we go through this. In measure 35, it says bring out. So this is kind of a underlying counter melody to what the first violins are doing. Since you've got a lot of half notes and whole notes through here, definitely use a lot of vibrato and make sure it continues through each note. In measure 35, make sure you're using a fourth finger on that A. In measure 36, you're going to use a high 3 for that G sharp. And then in 37, you might want to put an arrow down to remind yourself that the G goes back to natural, so that's just a regular G. In measure 39, I could handle an open D here, or you could use a fourth finger, or you could go into third position. Any of those options are fine. And then in measure 40, this one I am going to say we're going to go into third position. So if you're already there because you shifted in 39, that's great. Or measure 40 gives us a quarter rest where you can do the shift without having to do it immediately. So if you are shifting only on measure 40, you're going to go up to a third finger in third position for that B, and then the A will be a second finger. Okay, so that's not only going to let us avoid an open A for 2.5 beats, it's also going to give us the opportunity to vibrate it and accentuate that crescendo that's happening in that measure. In measure 41, you're going to stay in third position for those first 2 Bs and then shift down on the F sharp on the third beat. And then finally in 42, you've got a G sharp at the end of the measure, which you're going to play with a low 1. So that's what all that's going to look like. Let's just practice the shift to third position that's going to happen in measure 40 on the rest. So just like any other shift, we're going to talk about the finger that we're coming from and where that finger is going to end up in the final shift. So in this case, the finger that we're coming from is the second finger because we're using it for F natural in the end of measure 39. So if you think about where that F natural, where that second finger is going to go, it's going to go to A on your D string. So if you have a fourth finger tape, that's where your second finger is going to go. So the shift we're going to practice is from F natural to A. And then the B is your third finger a whole step away from that A. So then you can practice it with a slur. And then slowly take out the intermediate note. So what it'll sound like in actuality is 39. And you can get a really nice strong vibrato on that A. Other things to note before we play through this would be the dynamics and the articulations. Dynamic-wise, you're starting out 35 forte, that's where you left measure 34. If you want to remind yourself by putting another forte underneath measure 35, go for it. And then in 36, there's 4 beats of crescendo. You drop down to mezzo piano and then do a big crescendo all the way up to forte. 38, drop down to mezzo piano again, big crescendo up to forte. Stay forte for measure 39, and then measure 40, you drop down all the way to piano and do another big crescendo to forte. So this whole section is all about dramatically dropping back to a very quiet dynamic and then building back up to forte. And then finally, articulation-wise, look at measure 41. You've got an accent on the first eighth note and then a dot on the second eighth note. So what you're going to do is the first eighth note is going to be kind of legato and accented, heavy, and then on the second one, the up bow, you're actually going to come off the string a little bit. And the same thing happens in measure 42. So if we were just going to practice that on an open string, it would look like this. Okay, so the actual note is B natural first. And the following 2 quarter notes in both measures are going to be legato. Okay, that about does it. I'm going to set my metronome to 100 and play through this. 2, ready, and. So I find this section actually really fun to play. The fact that those whole notes with the crescendo starts at the tip of the bow really helps you go down to nothing and then slowly build as you get towards the frog. All right, happy practicing. I'll see you back here tomorrow for the next part. All right, violas, this is a really fun part today. So starting in 35, let's mark in a few things. The last note of 35, make sure you use a fourth finger for that A. And then the beginning of 36, you've got a G sharp, so you're going to use a high 3. You might want to mark on beat 3, that G is still sharp, it lasts throughout the entire measure. In 37, the G goes back to natural. I would definitely mark that either with an arrow down or with a natural sign. In 38, you can play both of those Ds open. 39, that last note is an F natural. This definitely got me when I was playing through this the first time, so I would recommend, again, arrow down or natural sign or both. In measure 40, you're going to play that D with a fourth finger. In measure 42, you've got a G sharp again, which is going to be a low 1. And then the last note of measure 42, you have to do this in third position. So it's going to be a third finger for the E. As you can see, there's a little line going from that E to the first note of 43. That indicates a slide. So you're going to go from third position on a third finger, slide on the third finger, and land on your first finger and the first note of 43. And we'll practice that here in a minute. Okay, once you've gotten all that written in, let's go ahead and talk about the shift that happens in measure 42 and then the slide after it. So just like any shift, we're going to talk about the finger that we're shifting from and where that finger ends up in the final position. In this case, we're shifting from a first finger, so a low 1 on the G string for that G sharp, and that first finger is going to go to your third finger tape. So the shift that we're going to practice is from G sharp to C. And then you put your third finger down for the E. You can do it with a slur. And then slowly take out that intermediate note, the C. So in this case, it's going to sound like this. Rest, rest. And then the slide, make sure that you're sliding on your third finger. So that's the finger that's going to create the slide. And you're going to lift your third finger off at the last second. So it sounds like this. Shift and rest. The only other things to point out before we play through this would be the dynamics in the articulation. You start out in measure 35 forte, and that lasts all the way to measure 40. In measure 40, without a decrescendo, you're going to go straight to piano, so subito piano. It's not marked subito piano, which means suddenly, but the fact that there's no decrescendo to get you into it, that's what that's implying. Then there's a crescendo, and you only get a beat and a half for this crescendo to get you all the way to forte. So you're going to have to really dig in and move that bow quickly. And then in measure 42, the last note, fortissimo, obviously the slide is kind of the show in this moment, so bring it out as much as you possibly can. You should definitely use a whole bow on that. And then finally, as far as articulation goes, just note in measures 41 and 42, there's two sets of 2/8 notes. The first one has an accent on it and the second one has a dot on it. So the first note is going to be longer and heavier, and then on the second note you're going to come off the string on that up bow. So if you want to practice that first without any fingers down, just on open G, set, accent, and then come off the string. So the actual notes would be, and just make sure that on that dotted note you really get out of the way because there's other things happening in those two quarter note rests. Other than that, all of your eighth notes and quarter notes throughout this section are going to be legato. That's pretty much all I have to say about it, so let's set our metronome at 100 and play through this. 2, ready, and rest, rest. Okay, really fun part. I hope you enjoy practicing it. I will see you back here tomorrow for the next section. Okay, cellos. So a little bit of a break today compared to what we were doing yesterday. Starting in 35, there's just a few shifts to mark in. In 35, I would really rather, instead of playing open A, we shift up to a third finger. So you would be here on A, and then your first finger would go up to your fourth finger tape on the D string, and then you put your third finger down for that A half note. And then back down for E. So it would be A, A, E. Then in 37, same thing, A, and then you can use your first finger for D for the whole note in measure 38. 39, A, and then you can go ahead in first position for measures 40 and 41, and then 42. The last note you're going to shift up on a third finger to E. So if you only have these first tapes, your first finger is actually going to go a whole step above. So here's C, here's D, that's where my first finger is going to go, and then E would be a whole step away from that. Okay, now this is a viola, so you're not going to be in the same position in relation to the shoulder of the instrument, but in relation to your tapes you will be. So again, looking at 42, you're playing E on the C string with the third finger. Then, or if you wanted, you could be playing it with the first finger, but in any case, to get to that E, the last note of 42, you're going to shift your first finger up to D on the G string, and you're going to play it here with your third finger. The reason we have to do this crazy shift is because if you'll notice there's a line between the last note of measure 42 and the first note of 43, that's indicating a slide. So we're going to slide all the way from that E on the third finger, and then at the last second, take your third finger off and play that low A. Okay, so 42 again is going to look like this. And like I said, if you want to start on a 1 for this E on the C string, that's perfectly fine. In fact, it'd probably be more comfortable, but so it's going to be E, 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 slide on the third finger, down to A. Now when I play it in a minute, obviously I won't be using the same fingers, but it'll sound the same. Okay, now that we've got the fingerings out of the way, let's talk about some of these rhythms. In measure 41, you've got a little bit of a syncopated rhythm. You're playing on 1, you're off on 2, and then back on the and of 2. So it's 1 and 3, 4, 1 and 3, 4, and that happens again in measure 42. Last but not least, there are a lot of dynamics and articulations marked through here. So you've got accents on the low A's. Make sure you're grabbing those accents, as well as the dynamics. You start out forte in measure 35, and then all of a sudden in 36 you drop down to mezzo piano. So this is a subito mezzo piano, meaning there's no decrescendo, it's just all of a sudden. And then you only have 4 beats in measure 36 to get all the way back to forte in 37. This happens again exactly the same way in 38. You drop down to mezzo piano. You're going to have to really lean in and save the bow so that you can get all the way to forte for 39. And then in measure 40, you're only given 2 eighth notes to get all the way from piano to forte. So this is going to take a lot of bow speed and bow weight in a short amount of time. The last note of 42 is marked fortissimo, so obviously you're going to want to really bring out this slide. It's kind of the big thing that's going on in that measure. So draw a lot of attention to it, hit it, and slide all the way down. And just as a reminder, we're sliding on the third finger and only lifting it up at the last second. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and set my metronome to 100 and play through this. 2 and up. Okay, so happy practicing, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for the next part. Alright, basses. So let's mark in a few things, starting at measure 35. You've got a couple of accents there, you might want to circle them. Then in measure 40, you're going to go into half position, play the E with a second finger, and then the C natural with a 4, and in 41, the E flat with a 1. 42, you're going to play that D open. And then at the end of 42, they've got this divisi both sliding to open A. I think it would be a lot easier to slide down to open A. So if you're on the outside and you would be playing that higher E, you're going to play it on your A string with your fourth finger. So if you're thinking about where that's going to be, if you were to play your high D, like on your G string, it's going to be in that exact same position but over on your A string. So you're going to be on fourth finger, and then you're going to slide all the way back down to open, and you're going to hear that slide all the way down and then just take your hand off at the last second. If it's not very comfortable to slide on a fourth finger, you can certainly use any finger you want as long as you're going to that same spot on the fingerboard. So where high D would be on your G string, straight across to your A string, whatever finger you want to use to slide, hit it, feel the slide and hear it all the way down, and then lift your finger off at the last second. Make sure your bow is still moving when you lift your left hand finger off, because we do need to hear that open A for the first note of 43. If you're on the inside, without having a bass to try it out on, I'm not sure how well this would work, but if you can get it to sound good sliding from open E to where A would be on your E string, be my guest. But if it's giving you a lot of trouble, just forget it and just use that fingering that we just talked about going from the top note, the top E. Let's talk about the dynamics for a second. Your forte, 35, 37, and 39. And then in measure 40, it's subito piano. It's not marked as a subito piano, but it's implied because there's no decrescendo. Then all of a sudden in 41, your forte. I will say every other section has a crescendo in that measure, except for you guys, so make sure that you really bring that out. That's clearly a choice that the composer made. So all of measure 40 is going to be piano, then subito forte in 41 and 42, and then of course that slide down or up from the E to the A is going to be fortissimo, because that's really the big show-stopping moment that's happening in this section. Okay, other than that, let's go ahead and set your metronome at quarter note equals 100 and play through this. 2, ready, go. The other thing I thought of while I was playing is on measures 35 and 37 and 39, you've got two quarter notes in a row, both with accents on them, so make sure you're catching a nice k at the beginning of the up bow. So you want the accent to speak at the beginning of both notes. So the up bow, you're going to have to lean in and actually catch the string for another accent. Okay, that's it for today, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for the next part.